I was standing in the pump house with a cheap little multimeter clipped onto two wires, half expecting to see a number that would barely light up a nightlight. And instead, the display settled on something that made me check the connections twice because I figured I'd hooked it up wrong. I hadn't. I moved the leads, tapped the meter against my palm the way you do when you don't trust a number but don't have a better reason not to. And it settled right back on the same reading, steady as anything, not a flicker of doubt in it. That's the moment this whole video comes from, so let's get right into it, no dragging it out. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because I dig into this kind of real off-grid stuff pretty regularly. Not the fantasy version, the version that actually has to work. Some of you have already seen the video I did on the gravity water system my grandfather built. The one that's been running for something like 70 years off a couple of creeks up the hill from the house, and if you haven't, that one's worth a watch before this one for context. That system was never about electricity. It was about getting water down to the house, the sprinklers, the orchard, using nothing but a pipe and a whole lot of elevation. Grandpa never had a single watt come out of that pipe in his whole life, and he never needed one, because that pipe was doing exactly the one job he built it to do. What I did this spring was ask a question he never had a reason to ask, which is, if this water's already falling downhill through a pipe under real pressure anyway, what's stopping me from grabbing some of that energy on its way down before it ever reaches the sprinkler? Turns out not much. That's the short version of this whole video, but let's actually walk through it properly, because the math on this surprised me more than I expected it to, and I think it'll surprise some of you too. Every hydro system, no matter how big or how small, comes down to two numbers. Head, which is just the vertical drop the water falls, before it gets to whatever's converting that energy into something useful, and flow, which is how much water is actually moving through the pipe at any given moment. My grandfather's system already had both of these in spades, because remember, the whole reason that pipe works at all is gravity pulling water downhill from a source higher up the mountain than the house. Exactly the setup I walked you through in that earlier video if you want the full backstory on how that pipe even got up there in the first place. He built a couple 100 feet of elevation drop into that system just to get enough water pressure for the sprinklers to work properly. I never thought of that elevation as anything other than a means to an end until I started looking at it differently. There's a rule of thumb the microhydro folks use that makes this dead simple to estimate without breaking out an engineering degree. Take your head in feet, multiply it by your flow in gallons per minute, and divide that by 10. That gives you a rough number in watts before you account for real-world losses. Measuring those two numbers is a lot less technical than it sounds, and I want to walk through it because I think a lot of people assume this requires surveying equipment they don't own. For flow, the classic method is embarrassingly simple. You divert the water into a bucket of known size and time, how long it takes to fill with a stopwatch, then do the math to figure out gallons per minute from there. I used a 5-gallon bucket and my phone stopwatch, standing there in my rubber boots counting under my breath like I was back in grade school. For head, if you've already got a closed pipe system like this one instead of an open channel, there's an even easier trick. Screw a pressure gauge onto a spigot at the bottom of the pipe with everything closed off so there's no flow, just static pressure, and read the number in pounds per square inch. Water pressure works out to right around 0.433 psi for every foot of vertical drop. So you just divide your gauge reading by that number and it hands you your head and feet without you ever having to climb the hill with a surveyor's level. I had a rough idea of my elevation drop from years of walking that hillside, but the pressure gauge gave me an actual number I could trust instead of a guess. My system's got somewhere around 180 feet of usable head by the time the water gets down near the house, and depending on the season, I'm running somewhere between 15 and 25 gallons a minute through that pipe. Let's just use 20 for easy math. 180 times 20 is 3,600. Divide that by 10, and you land on 360 watts, theoretical, before efficiency losses. Once you knock that down for real-world turbine and generator efficiency, which typically runs somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% for a small setup like mine, you're looking at something in the range of 150 to 200 watts, continuously, day and night, rain or shine, whether I'm home or not. That last part is the piece that actually rewired how I think about power out here. 150 to 200 watts doesn't sound like much next to a 400-watt solar panel, and on paper, in bright sun, it isn't. But that panel only makes real numbers for a handful of hours a day. And it makes basically nothing for about 16 hours out of every 24. More than that on a cloudy week in the winter, which is exactly when I need power the most, and exactly when the sun's giving me the least. This little pipe doesn't care what time it is or what the sky's doing. It runs at 2 in the morning exactly the same as it runs at 2 in the afternoon. Do the math on watt hours over a full day, instead of just watts on a spec sheet. And a modest little hydro setup like this one ends up outproducing a much bigger solar array over the course of an actual week. Especially the kind of gray, wet week we get plenty of around here. Comment down below if you've got a year-round creek or spring on your own property, because I'm curious how many of you are sitting on the same kind of untapped setup I was for years, without ever thinking about it this way. Doesn't have to be dramatic elevation either. From what I've read, plenty of people are running usable little systems off drops that would barely qualify as a hill around here. So don't rule yourself out just because you're not sitting on a mountainside. For the actual turbine, I went with a Pelton wheel. And if you've never heard of one, it's basically a wheel with a ring of little spoon-shaped buckets around the outside, and instead of the water flowing through it the way it would through a propeller, a nozzle shoots a concentrated jet of water directly at those buckets, and the wheel spins from the impact. It's named after an American engineer, Lester Pelton, who came up with the design back in the 1870s, and the same basic bucket and jet principle he worked out has scaled both up and down since then in ways I don't think even he would have guessed. The biggest versions of this design run in Swiss mountain plants under almost 2,000 feet of head, moving enough water to power a small city, which is a scale I genuinely can't picture standing here next to my own little setup. The smallest versions show up in things like dental drills, believe it or not, same impulse principle, just shrunk down to a size you'd never recognize unless somebody told you. Mine sits somewhere way down on the small end of that range, closer to the dental drill than the Swiss dam, but it's the exact same idea either way, water hitting a bucket and turning a shaft, no matter how many zeros are attached to the wattage number at the end of it. The reason a Pelton wheel made sense for me and not one of the other turbine types is that they're specifically the right tool for exactly this situation, high head, comparatively low flow, which describes just about every gravity-fed mountain water system I've ever seen out here. The other common types, the Francis and Kaplan turbines, want the opposite setup, lower head with a whole lot more water moving through them, which is more what you'd find on a wide, slow river than a little pipe running down a steep hillside. So picking the right one really does come down to reading your own site honestly, instead of just grabbing whatever's cheapest online. Pelton wheels also tend to handle a bit of grit and debris in the water better than some of the more finely machined turbine designs, which matters a lot when your water source is a mountain creek and not a filtered municipal line. That said, better tolerance for debris isn't the same thing as no tolerance for debris. I still run a screen at the intake to keep the bigger stuff out, the same kind of screen material I use on the domestic side of the water system, because a decent-sized twig or a pebble getting fired through that nozzle at full pressure can chip a bucket or clog the jet outright. And I'd rather clean a screen once a week than pull the whole housing apart to dig out something that shouldn't have been in there in the first place. I didn't machine mine from scratch before anybody asks, because I've got better things to do with my winter than turning a chunk of bronze on a lathe for 3 weeks, and I've got a lot more respect now for the guys who did exactly that back before you could just order the parts. There are small manufacturers building complete Pelton units specifically for homestead-scale setups like this. Some of them putting out anywhere from a few hundred watts up into the low kilowatts depending on your head and flow, which covers basically the entire range of gravity water systems you'd find on a piece of property like mine. I bought the wheel and the nozzle assembly, built my own housing and mounting out of stuff I already had lying around the shop, and spliced it into the existing pipe run with a T fitting a little ways above the house, well before the water ever gets down to the sprinkler manifold. Now, before you go tearing apart your own gravity water system this weekend, a word on the legal side of this, because it genuinely matters more than the mechanical side does in a lot of places. Just because water crosses your land doesn't automatically mean you have an unrestricted right to use it, especially out here in the West, where water law gets complicated fast and doesn't always follow the property lines you'd expect. My grandfather's original diversion predates a lot of the modern permitting mess, which is a big part of why we've never had to deal with it for the water system itself. Adding a turbine to an existing already permitted diversion is a very different situation than cutting a brand new diversion into a stream that's never been touched. And if you're starting from scratch instead of working off an old family system like I am, you genuinely need to look into your state's water rights process before you put a shovel in the ground. Most micro-hydro setups are what they call non-consumptive, meaning the water goes right back into the stream after it spins the turbine instead of getting used up, which helps your case a lot, but it doesn't automatically exempt you from needing a permit depending on where you live. This is not the part of the video to skip just because the turbine part sounds like more fun. There's an environmental side to this too, separate from the legal paperwork, and I think it deserves its own mention instead of getting lumped in as a footnote for the sake of moving the video along faster. Even a non-consumptive system that returns all its water back to the stream can still cause problems if you're pulling too big a share of the flow out at once, especially during the low water months. Reduced flow downstream can warm the water up, change what's living in it, and in some streams create barriers that fish can't get past on their way to spawn. My setup only ever diverts a portion of what's already being diverted for the water system anyway, and the creek this feeds off of runs strong enough year-round that I'm not putting any real dent in it. But that's a judgment call you have to make honestly about your own site, instead of assuming small automatically means harmless. A good rule, a lot of the guidance out there lands on, is to leave the majority of a stream's flow doing what it was already doing and only take a modest slice for yourself, which is easy to say and takes some actual observation over a full year to get right, watching how the creek behaves in the driest part of summer before you ever commit to a final intake size. Getting the power out of the turbine and into something usable is where it started to feel a lot more familiar to me, honestly, because it's basically the exact same setup I've talked about before for solar, right down to a lot of the same components doing a slightly different job. The turbine and generator put out a variable voltage depending on flow conditions, not all that different from how a solar panel's output shifts around with the sun, and a charge controller sits between that generator and the battery bank to smooth all of that out into something the battery can actually use without getting damaged. Some of the fancier hydro-specific controllers work a lot, like the MPPT controllers I talked about in that solar video, constantly adjusting to pull the most usable power out of whatever the turbine's currently producing. Because the hydro output is so much steadier than solar to begin with, you can actually get away with a simpler controller in a lot of setups than you'd want for a shaded solar panel, which was a pleasant surprise after how particular I've gotten about controller choice on the solar side of things. There's also the question of what you do with the power when the batteries are already full, because unlike a solar panel, which more or less just stops producing once the sun goes behind a cloud, or the controller tells it to back off, a hydro turbine spinning under constant water pressure doesn't have quite as graceful an off switch. Most small hydro setups use what's called a diversion load, basically a dump load like a big resistive heater element that soaks up any extra power once the battery's topped off, so the turbine's always got somewhere for that energy to go instead of the system trying to choke back the water flow itself, which is a lot harder to do smoothly on the fly. Mine dumps the extra into a water heater element sitting in an old stock tank, which sounds a little silly until you remember that free hot water is still free hot water, even if it started out as a byproduct of not letting your battery overcharge. The battery bank barely has to work for a living with this thing running. With solar, your battery is doing the heavy lifting of storing a big surge of daytime energy, so you've got something to draw on all night. With a steady hydro trickle running 24 hours a day, the battery's job shrinks down to just smoothing out the difference between what the turbine's making at any given moment and what you're actually pulling out of it right then, which is a much easier job than storing an entire day's worth of sunshine to get you through the dark. I'm still running a battery bank because my actual usage isn't perfectly steady either, but it's a smaller, easier working battery bank than the one my solar setup depends on to get through a long winter night. One thing I had to account for that never came up with the original water system is freeze protection on the turbine housing itself. The pipe running the water has always handled our winters fine because it's buried in most places and running fast enough not to sit still and freeze. But a turbine housing sitting exposed at the bottom end of that pipe is a different animal, especially with water misting off it after it hits those buckets. I insulated the housing and made sure there's enough of a heat source nearby, just a small bit of waste heat off the equipment itself in an enclosed box, to keep things from icing up on the handful of nights a year that actually get cold enough here to be a concern. If you're somewhere with real winters, this is a bigger consideration than it was for me, and you'll want to plan the housing and any exposed plumbing around it a lot more carefully than I had to. I'll admit the first version of my housing didn't account for this well enough, and I found that out the hard way one cold snap last year when I walked down to check on things and found the whole nozzle assembly wearing a decent-sized icicle beard, completely frozen solid and not producing a single watt. Nothing cracked, thankfully, but it sat there useless for the better part of 2 days until things warmed back up, which is exactly the kind of lesson you'd rather learn from a video than from your own frozen turbine. I also want to be honest that this isn't going to replace a grid connection or run a house full of modern conveniences by itself. 150 to 200 watts continuous works out to something like 3.5 to 4.5 kilowatt hours a day if you just multiply it out, which is enough to keep a battery bank topped, run some LED lighting, keep a well pump or a couple of freezers cycling, charge whatever tools and devices need charging, and generally take a real bite out of what I used to need, the solar array, and a generator to cover between them. It is not enough to run an electric water heater or central air conditioning, and anybody telling you a setup this size will do, that is selling you something, probably the same somebody who wants to sell you a solar array twice as big as you actually need too. What it's genuinely good at is being the boring, dependable baseline that's just always there in the background, quietly filling in the gaps that solar leaves open every single night and every gray week without me having to think about it, adjust it, or point it at the sun. That's really the part that got me. I went into this expecting a fun little side project that might shave a few dollars off what the solar and battery bank had to cover. What I got instead was a system that, watt hour for watt hour over a full week, is quietly outpunching a piece of gear that cost me a lot more money and takes up a lot more of my attention. My grandfather built this pipe to solve one problem, water pressure for a house on a hill, and never once thought about what else that falling water might be worth. I don't think that's a knock on him. He built exactly what he needed, and it's still working exactly as designed 70 years later, which is more than I can say for most things I've built myself. I just happened to be standing downstream of it at a point in history where turning falling water into electricity got cheap and simple enough for one guy with a shop full of spare parts to bolt onto the side of an existing system instead of needing to be some kind of engineer to pull it off. I think about that gap between his generation and mine a fair amount, honestly. He solved his problem with a pipe, some elevation, and a screwdriver twice a year. I solved a completely different problem using the exact same pipe, without changing a single thing about what he originally built, just by asking one more question of it than he ever had reason to ask. That feels like the right way to build on something somebody left you. Not tearing it out and starting over, just noticing there was more in it than the original job called for. If there's a lesson in this one, it's that a lot of us are probably sitting on more capability than we realize, built into systems we already have running for some other reason entirely. I wasn't looking for a power source when I went to go fix a low-pressure sprinkler this spring. I was just trying to figure out why the yard wasn't getting enough water, same as always. It wasn't until I started actually measuring what that pipe was doing on its way downhill that I realized I'd been walking past a power plant for years without ever once thinking of it as one. I'll put together a proper parts and cost breakdown video soon for anybody who wants to look at doing this on their own gravity system, because I know watching me talk about head and flow in the abstract isn't quite the same as seeing actual numbers and actual receipts sitting in front of you. For now, if you've got water falling downhill on your property for any reason at all, go find out how far it's falling and how fast it's moving, because you might be a lot closer to your own little power plant than you think. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.